Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined once again by a channel favorite, and that is Razib Khan. Mr. Khan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. I always love it, Nick.
Today's episode naturally involves a subject that you love, and that is DNA combined with another subject that you love, which is history. And so with that being said, today we're going to be diving into the origins of the Vikings. But before diving in, I want to remind you, my subscribers, check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to all of the awesome work that Razib Khan is doing to help people like me and you better understand the subjects that we all love. And I cannot encourage you enough to become a member of his Substack. I am as well. And seriously, the episodes and articles that he provides are absolutely fantastic, from hosting the top experts within Indo-European studies to Bronze Age favorites such as archaeologist Dr. Eric Klein. And so that's enough of my publicity for today. We're going to dive in. And so without further ado, Mr. Khan, when you think of the Vikings, based on your research or imagination, what comes to your mind?
You know, a lot of the viewers, the listeners, will know what comes to my mind are, these kind of violent raiders in their longboats, right? And like we've all watched the TV shows or read the books. A Viking is a verb, right? To go Viking. So it's an action. It's not necessarily a people or ethnicity, though it's obviously associated with the people and ethnicity. I mean, that would be more properly like the Norse, the Danes, the Sver, the various tribes, the tribes of Gotland, the Swedes, a combination of these various tribes. So Viking is kind of like describing an activity that they did for several centuries, more than several centuries, arguably, kind of around like 800 AD to 1000 AD. And so that's what they didn't go to battle with helmets with horns, obviously. Those are just kind of like ritual objects, but they're pagan people, they're not Christian, they're raiding Northern Europe, and they tend to come from Scandinavia. Ergo, they tend to be Scandinavians. But it's kind of an interesting term because Scandinavians were never Vikings because they never went to Viking.
Before talking about the Vikings and their DNA, I want to backtrack a little bit. I want to talk about Northern Europe. When it comes to the populations within Northern Europe, what has been the traditional viewpoint as to where these peoples originally came from?
The traditional viewpoints have changed multiple times, as some of your viewers and listeners will know. Archaeologists have had various debates on how deeply indigenous they were or not indigenous. Until about like 20 years ago, I think the dominant view was that the populations of Northern Europe descend from the populations that were present in Europe, extant in Europe, at the end of the last ice age 12,000 years ago. Obviously, they're not native to Northern Europe because Northern Europe was covered by an ice sheet. Okay, Scandinavia is still bouncing back. The crust is still bouncing back from that. But, the argument is they come from the south. They're Pleistocene hunter-gatherers. What ancient DNA has done is transformed our understanding of that, insofar as we now know that most of the ancestry in Northern Europe on the order of 80%, probably more, in Southern Europe on the order of 95% of that ancestry is actually not indigenous to Western or Central Europe as of 12,000 years ago, or as of, frankly, like 9,000 years ago. The hunter-gatherers of the European Pleistocene, the Magdalenian culture, the Grevetian culture, the Solutrean culture, all these cultures, they left very, very little impact on modern European genomes. And in fact, modern European genomes descend mostly from Anatolian farmers. So before that, they were hunter-gatherers during late Pleistocene, and also from people in Eastern Europe, modern-day Ukraine, that area, and the Transcaucasus region. So they're kind of newcomers to the continent within the last 10,000 years. And Northern Europeans, they descend from a mix of these various peoples that occurred kind of in the middle to late Bronze Age.
And so as we approach leaving the Ice Age, we're approaching the Bronze Age. I want to talk about a fascinating culture, and that is the battle axe culture, Who are they, and how does this play into this conversation?
Because Northern Europe, because Scandinavia, the Nordic countries are cold, ancient DNA is well preserved, and some of the best departments for studying ancient DNA are in Denmark or Sweden. And this is partly just due to their experience and expertise in population genomics, but to a large extent, it's because they have a wealth of materials that they have native access to because they're present in the nations of concern. So basically, it turns out that at the beginning of the Holocene, about 12,000 years ago, the native people in Scandinavia, they are labeled originally, because population geneticists are very original, Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. And they're genetically kind of equidistant between Eastern European hunter-gatherers and Western European hunter-gatherers. Western European hunter-gatherers, probably the most famous example for your listeners or viewers, would be Cheddar Band. They tended to be blue-eyed, dark-skinned. Eastern European hunter-gatherers, they flourished in Karelia and Western Ukraine. They tend to be more related to Paleo-Siberian people, and their physical appearance was more mixed. Scandinavian hunter-gatherers looked like to be a mix of these, both Eastern and Western, that came out of a synthesis. There's actually some archaeological evidence of how it happened. It looks like Eastern European hunter-gatherers came up over Scandinavia, up through the north, came around, whereas like the Western hunter-gatherers came up through the Baltic. Okay, so the two mixed. So that's who the indigenous people of Scandinavia were. Well, they did not stay dominant forever. And about 5,000 years ago, you had farmers from the south, descendants of the LBK culture, the linear pottery people. And these are descended from Anatolian farmers. Genetically, their closest relatives are Sardinians. They show up into Scandinavia. This is the edge of their range. Farming with the Neolithic cultural toolkit, cultural package, is really, really on the margins of sustainability in southern Scandinavia. And so these are marginal people. They have some hunter-gatherer admixture by now. And so, these are the people that are flourishing there about 5,000 years ago. North of them, probably in the northern two-thirds of Sweden, there are different people who are still indigenous hunter-gatherers. We don't know as much about them today, although a little bit more about them later. So what happens is these Neolithic people, eventually around like 2500 BC, probably a little earlier, they get overwhelmed by a people of the corded ware horizon. The corded ware is from the pottery. So the corded ware are a mix of people from probably the Caucasus region with indigenous European hunter-gatherers. They probably descend from Yamnaya or Yamnaya-related people, Indo-Europeans as such, right? In Scandinavia, though, they transform culturally somewhat. They synthesize with the native European farmer substrate, the funnel beaker culture and whatnot. In Denmark, they're called the single grave culture. They're really creative, these archaeologists, in terms of how they name them. But in Scandinavia, they call them the battle axe culture. So why are they called the battle axe culture? These people, they were buried with ceremonial battle axes. It's all about ceremony for them. It's not like axes are multi-purpose. So I'm only bringing this up because friends of mine are like, I think like we would be much more interested in Northern European prehistory if they were called the mace pendant people, because the corded ware were buried with mace pendants. So I think in a previous episode I mentioned, what do you do with maces? Okay, so these battle axe people are buried with sacred battle axes, because it's sacred, right? And so they show up here, and then this is the end of the Neolithic farmers. They absorb the last of the Neolithic farmers, and they coexist in Sweden, in particular, with a group called the pitted ware culture, and that's based on their pottery. They're hunter-gatherers, they're fishermen. They probably lived at relatively high density in these marine environments, and so they kind of had a standoff with the last farmers and also the battle axe people. There is evidence of basically physical conflict between the last of the farmer peoples as they retreated south due to climatic change, as the hunter-gatherers are conflicting with them. And so after about 2500 BCE, there was a process of an amalgamation between the pitted ware, who seemed to be related in some way to the southern Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, and perhaps some more eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry as well, and these new battle axe people, these new Indo-Europeans, right? And we go into the Nordic Bronze Age. So the Nordic Bronze Age, well, it's the Bronze Age, right? It's between 2000 BC and like about 580 or 500 BC when the Iron Age hits Northern Europe. This is basically setting the stage for European Northern European genetic background, as we understand it. They absorbed the last of the hunter-gatherers, probably the far north, like where the Sami are. They actually did hold out and were never assimilated until the Sami showed up, these reindeer herders. And then there were still pockets of Neolithic farmers in places like, is it the Kattegat, the island where Copenhagen is, right? And so, like, archaeologists have actually shown, like, the Bad Lax people, the Sigma Grave people, these Indo-Europeans, they actually coexisted, for a little while with these Neolithic people. They intermarried eventually to the point where the latter disappeared. And so this is how we get the Iron Age cultures that we know that became the Vikings. And it all goes back to the Bronze Age. Ask Eric Klein.
When it comes to the origins of the Northern Europeans and the advances in DNA, what would you say the most important aspects are that have been either debunked or confirmed by these results?
There's actually a lot of argument about whether the Finnic people, the Finnic-speaking people, they speak a Finno-Ugric language, Uralic language, whether they are the indigenous inhabitants of Norden, because Scandinavia only excludes Finland, right, of the Nordic countries, or whether the Indo-Europeans, came first, so there's arguments about this, right? Well, so it turns out we have DNA now. 70% of Finnish males carry a Y chromosome lineage that you can trace back to the Taimyr Peninsula and parts in central Siberia. And ancient DNA is telling us that this showed up between, say, 1000 BC and 500 BC. So the Finnic languages are intrusive. Okay, so that I think we don't know what language they spoke, but it's awful suspicious that 70% of males in Finland have this Y chromosome and 5% of men in Sweden do. And they're probably due to gene flow from Finland during the unified, political kingdom. So now we know that the Finnic people are intrusive. They're not indigenous. Who's indigenous? Well, the people in Finland before the modern day Finnish lineages show up, recorded where they were Bad Lax. The Bad Lax Y chromosome was R1A usually in Finland. Only 5% of Finnish males are R1A now. So, maybe they just decided, gentlemanly to kind of cede, the land to their new Finnic overlords. I don't know what happened here. I'll leave it to your imagination. But so we know that in terms of like the western part, the Scandinavians were actually probably dominant all the way into Finland, and then something happened during the Iron Age where they kind of like lost their sway on that side of the Gulf of Bothnia. And by the time we have history, we have this ethnic divide between the Finns and the Swedes, and this kind of like dynamic, which hopefully we'll talk about a little going forward, that kind of defines the early medieval period in the Great Northern world.
And so when it comes to the origins of the Vikings and their genetic makeup, what has the traditional viewpoint been on the Vikings?
Well, I mean, traditionally archaeologists and historians, they didn't like really think about folk migrations and genetic changes. They kind of focused on culture, even though if you read I don't know, if you read the sagas, like they're migrating to Vinland and all this stuff. There's all these sagas of men joining the Varangian Guard in Byzantium, going through the Baltic and the Russian rivers and whatnot. And so yeah, there's a lot of people moving around, but historians and archaeologists after World War II have kind of been like a little leery of this migrationism, this folk wandering, which was associated with, let's be frank, the Nazis and a lot of nationalistic viewpoints. And so ancient DNA has kind of made people confront the reality that actually there was a lot of migration, there was a lot of gene flow, and this was just part of our history. And it's not like Nazi fantasy. This is like really based on the science. It's based on reality. And you started with a really, really deep ancient history, and have progressively moved closer, partly because the technology has gotten cheaper and cheaper, which means that you can look at questions which have other avenues of analysis. So some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about, obviously there are texts, there's archaeology, there's a lot that we know about these Vikings. So for example, economic historians love to talk about how the rise of Islam led to an influx of dinars, during the Caliphate into Sweden and the Baltic in general, probably up through the Volga Bulgars and whatnot. And so, I mean, these people are on the edge of history already. And, they show up in the, like early 9th century in Lindisfarne with their sackings and their attacks on the kingdoms of England at the time, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And then, obviously Ireland. They lay siege to Paris. They extort, the king of France. They go at Constantinople as well. I mean, they're all over the place. They show up in southern. They actually show up in southern Spain. They get into the Mediterranean. Like Vikings are everywhere. They're everywhere. They didn't leave their genes everywhere though, and so this current wave of exploration of this topic is focused on the genes. And I do want listeners. Let's see, population genomics of the Viking world. It's a paper you can find free copies of it online. It was, I think, originally in Science, if I'm correct, but they're free copies online. It came out last year, and it used a huge data set of Vikings, compare them to modern Scandinavians and other peoples around the world, and try to come to some conclusions. And again, like I said, because of preservation conditions, we're talking sample sizes in dozens and dozens. Okay, like not just like a couple individuals here and there, but they have a lot of Viking age samples that they can compare to modern, medieval, and like prehistoric.
And so now I want to approach the question that all of our subscribers are waiting on. And that is, what has DNA told us about who the Vikings were?
They weren't totally different from what we know. Okay? They weren't totally different from what we know. On the whole, they are the descendants of these people from the Nordic Bronze Age. On the whole, on average, they are the ancestors of modern Scandinavians. Okay? These Viking samples. But there are differences. Okay? So what are the differences? The Vikings went to England. They went to Ireland. They stayed. Some of them became Hiberno, Hiberno Norse or Norse Gales, whatever you want to call them. Some of them stayed in the Danelaw. Some of them went to Russia, okay, and they stayed there. And so Kievan Rus is a Viking state. It was founded by a Swedish man. Now we have the ancient DNA of the Rurikids who descend from him. All the ruling houses in Russia, they actually have a Finnish Y chromosome. This means that the founder of Kievan Rus was probably a Scandinavianized Finn, if that makes sense. So he probably had an ancestor in Finland who was probably a local warlord. This is my hypothesis. The Swedish started interacting quite aggressively, and I think he decided that it was better to become Swedish. Okay, so he eventually his lineage became Swedish. By the time they show up in Novgorod the Great, they are worshiping the Norse gods, not Finnish gods. They're speaking in Swedish, but the Y chromosome lineage is clearly a Finnish lineage. So we know that the Vikings actually had a synthetic interaction with the Finnic peoples to the east. That's just concrete proof, right? In terms of how things have changed genetically, in Sweden, in modern Sweden, there's clearly gene flow from the east when you compare to the Vikings. In Norway and Denmark, there's gene flow from the west. Is this surprising? We don't have monks in Norway and Sweden telling us about the Viking ships coming back. We don't have records of that because they weren't Christian yet. We don't know what they thought. We only see it from the perspective of the Christians. We don't know like the whole life cycle of the heathen. We see the heathen at the most violent stage of the heathen, life in a way. So imagine you're a pagan Slav in Eastern Europe at that period. Like, what is your perception going to be of German Christians? All you're going to see them is by their sword, right? And so Vikings were violent. I don't want to deny that. These are obviously a militaristic people, but let's also remember that we see them kind of in a biased view by the people they were despoiling, that they were conquering, that they were marauding. We don't have them in their own words, except for maybe the Prose Eddas and some of these sagas, right? And that's kind of garbled and confused, partly because they were recorded by their Christian descendants who, they have their own agendas, let's be honest. So what we see in the Viking world is that there's been genetic change of influence by their European neighbors, because this is a period where Vikings went out and they came back, okay? It wasn't just a one-directional gene flow. There's also, this was well known, but now we can confirm it with ancient DNA, Viking ancestry in Northern England, Viking ancestry in Ireland, Viking ancestry elsewhere. It depends on what the population size of the source is and the target in these sorts of things. But I think this be intuitively obvious. What is less intuitively obvious, I think, is there is some evidence here that the Vikings have changed. The people of Scandinavia have changed genetically in terms of their characteristics. A higher fraction of modern Scandinavians can digest milk. Okay, so there's been natural selection. There's been adaptation and evolution. We kind of already knew this as geneticists. I'm going to tell you straight up. There's already signatures in modern Northern European genomes that are the modern Northern Europeans have been selected for digesting milk even up until the present. That their skeletal structure has been getting thinner and thinner, and also they've been becoming lighter. So these Vikings, some of them were already blonde, but I can tell you from other work I've seen in Estonia, this Nordic phenotype that we think about, it's actually something that's come about over 3,000 years gradually. The ancestors who descend from the Nordic Bronze Age, they were somewhat more mixed in appearance. If listeners want to Google, you know what, I will send you the link so you can post it. But I've looked really closely at the Estonian data because they have really, really long transects, and they're some of the palest people in the world. And it's quite clear that Iron Age Estonians were much darker. I mean, I'm not saying that they were olive skinned, but much higher fraction had brown eyes and dark hair than is the case today. And they have suggestive evidence in this paper that some of the same was happening after the Viking Age, as natural selection has been changing these northern people in place. We don't know why. We don't know what's going on. There's only so much we can say, but we can describe what's happening, and they are changing in terms of characteristics. Another thing is immune profile. They've been adapting to disease census, which makes sense. They didn't go through the Black Death yet. They weren't exposed to a lot of the plagues and pandemics that were going to happen in the last 1,000 years.
And to make this even more complicated, as DNA has continued to mix with history, we've also found that these Viking raiders were not always one and the same. And what I mean by that is occasionally you see people who are not Northern European, at least not in the sense that we know them. And Mr. Khan, would you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so they assimilated indigenous, quote unquote, indigenous European tribes, European people. Picts. I did mention earlier the Norse Gaels. They seem to be a cultural hybrid of Norse and Irish, probably mostly Norse male with Irish women. There were this paper actually did find some evidence of whole families moving, including women. But I think on the whole, we can assume that in many areas this was a movement of males, and there are people who descend from Vikings in these areas. So where do the women come from? Well, they're local women. So William the Conqueror, his mother was probably of local French heritage background, and his father was I think his father was the son of Rollo or the grandson of Rollo the Viking. And so you have this hybridity between the Vikings and the people they conquered and mixed with. And this is also one reason why there is evidence in Scandinavia itself of Irish or English or Russian type ancestry or Finnish type ancestry, because some of these individuals that are born in Ireland or born in the Danelaw, when the Viking kingdoms fell, they didn't all stay. Some of them went back to Scandinavia as genetically half Scandinavian, but culturally mostly Scandinavian, probably in their orientation. I mentioned already Rurik, who was the warlord, the Swedish quote unquote warlord, who shows up in Novgorod the Great and created an empire in Western Russia. We know now genetically his paternal lineage was Finnish. So, where they were originally is not always where they end. And so, like I said, Viking is not a people. It is a practice. It is a way of life. Now, you can't deny that that way of life is interactive with Northern Europe and Scandinavia, but that doesn't mean that it's exclusively Northern European or Scandinavian in character at that time. Because look, I know some of you guys out there are pretty barbaric. Some of you probably like, good church boys on Sunday. Some of you, not so much. And it was probably like that back then. And so some people are probably thinking, this pillaging and, I'm not going to say the other things that they're doing. But some of these guys are probably like, this is looking pretty good. So, bye-bye Christ, like hello Thor, right? I mean, this clearly happened. This clearly happened in Ireland. I think there's the best examples of people of like Christian women having pagan sons. And so like this culture flourished for centuries before eventually they were Christianized and they became Northern European in a very, very fundamental way, part of Christendom, part of the world of civilization as they understood it. I have said, this is kind of like a half joke, but Christianity made the Vikings white. They were no longer heathen, right? They were no longer the other. They were no longer aliens, savages, barbarians. All of a sudden, they become these tall, beautiful, angelic looking blonde Northern Europeans who people can admire for their fair skin. Before, they're described as animals, So it's just, I think the Vikings are very complex and we have reduced caricatures of who they are. I also think we don't need to be revisionist and not deny the brutality of their lives and the way they behaved. We can create Marxist narratives of Malthusian conditions and overpopulations, but we know what they did, and I think the Viking story is related to some of the stories that I've talked about with you in the past. And I will be talking. You mentioned my Substack. I will be talking about my Substack, razib.substack.com. I will be talking about it in the future about kind of the early Indo-European societies, which I think persisted down into the Iron Age in many ways. The Viking lifestyle is not that different than some of the stuff you see in the Rig Veda. And also read the Mahabharata, read the Ramayana. Like, these are kind of like these nomadic, semi-nomadic peoples ruled by warlords, ruled by princes, and dominated by magicians, wielding mantras, and like all these like strange creatures and peoples, whether it be frost giants and elves and all these things. And perhaps in a future episode, we could talk about like my hypotheses and hunches that these might be like contacts between genetically very different people, because that's one of the things that we're discovering about Europe, that it's actually homogenized a lot, that the whole world has homogenized a lot in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years with the rise of empire. Before that, there were people in Europe that looked at each other that were like totally physically different, and whose genetic difference was as striking and strong as between Chinese and modern Northern Europeans today that lived in Germany for thousands of years right next to each other along the same river drainage basin. There was like a whole different world that we don't know about, but that we perhaps have a sense of through our myth, right? And the Vikings, they've faded from history and become myths in our popular culture. What DNA is doing is it's kind of put more flesh into the bones, literally. Instead of just bones, like, we're actually reconstructing what they look like in the flesh. And they looked a little bit different than maybe modern Northern Europeans, modern Scandinavians, but the basics are already there.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today at the Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Mr. Khan has done another fantastic job of breaking down large spans of history and really just dissecting it in a way that everyone can enjoy and understand it, as he makes it even more complicated by combining history with what DNA tells us today to help us better understand the past. And to our subscribers, don't forget, check out the links in the video description below. Give him your full support and honestly help him make history matter. Mr. Khan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
I love it, Nick.